Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this one of our first Diplomat Diaries of 2025. So, first of all, Happy New Year to you all. We are extremely privileged that we have to start off this series of conversations with important diplomats around Delhi, which we have been hosting since last year. We are privileged this year to have with us Excellency Sooklal, who represents South Africa in India and knows India well, but knows South Africa even better, and is here to communicate to us the relationship that exists, historical and contemporary, between the two nations. Also reflecting on South Africa's journey as a country that is increasingly shaping Africa and the global order. He has been South Africa's, I was looking at the bio, BRICS Sherpa, G20 Sherpa, IPSA Sherpa, and IORA Sherpa. So it's covering in the entire world. We are very privileged to have him with us to discuss South African foreign policy, South Africa's engagement with India, and how South Africa looks at itself in the emerging global order, which is, even as we speak, is being redefined by Mr. Trump and his policies. So we are in for a feast, sir. Over to you. We will have your intervention to begin with, and then we will open up for an engagement with the audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Pant and the ORF, and to all of you for giving me this privilege to be on this platform this afternoon. My greetings to my sister, Ambassador of Zimbabwe. Very nice to see you, Ambassador. Oh, my brother from Algeria. Congratulations. He's recently been appointed ambassador to South Africa. So he's going from one BRICS country to another. And hopefully you'll become a BRICS partner soon as well. So thank you for this opportunity. I've had a long association with ORF, participated in several of your Raisina dialogues and Cape Town conversations. The inaugural edition of it, I was still based in South Africa. And I've always admired the work that comes out of ORF and also the expansion of your Raisina dialogue to other parts of the world. And we're glad that you also have Africa as part of that process. And I've also admired Professor Harsh Pant and the work that he does, very prolific, and always follow on Twitter some of the things that he's doing on LinkedIn. So how long do I have, Professor?
You can take as much time as you want.
No. You know, my wife always say that once I start talking, you must look at the calendar in the back at the time. I would like a more interactive session so that we get a chance to exchange views. I always say I learn more from you than when I come here to give you my perspectives on issues of global concern. Briefly, let me touch on relations between India and South Africa. I was a few days ago at the Vivekananda International Foundation, and let me say that my perspective of life has been shaped by the environment I've been brought up in. I was born and raised under an apartheid government. And very early in life, I understood that I'm defined by the color of my skin in my country, and that there are certain restrictions around what I can and cannot do. And most of my political enlightenment came quite early during my initial schooling period. I questioned why did I have to go to a school that was built and created only for people of Indian origin. Like, as you know, apartheid means separateness, so all of us were separated. So that had a profound impact on me, and as I went into high school, we became more politicized. You couldn't help but being politicized in South Africa because of the environment you found yourself in. And I also came from a family that had deep roots and was deeply rooted in Indian culture and spirituality. So that's also shaped my upbringing. So from a very early age, I was exposed to, I had a natural affinity for Asia. From my schooling period, I just had an affinity for Asia, perhaps a previous life imprint on me. But my favorite subject in school was geography. The only book prize I got in high school was for geography. But the world fascinated me. But there was one part of the world that fascinated me, and it was this region, Asia. And of course, India, knowing that my roots were from this part of the world, but at that stage, not knowing quite where. I'm still trying to find the exact village. But it was that apartheid era, as well as my cultural identity. So I knew from a very early period that I traversed two worlds. My Africanness, of which I was very proud, born and raised. I keep saying it's African blood that runs through my veins. But at the same time, I have within me, in my being, India immersed as well. So I'm the marriage of two worlds. And I was deeply influenced. I was saying my PhD was on the Ramakrishna mission in South Africa. So I was a great fan of Swami Vivekananda, having studied him and read all of his books. So when I started looking at a topic for PhD, he had a major impact on me. And he had a major impact on my political philosophy, as did Sri Aurobindo, who I also admired greatly and studied, and I've written papers on both of them. As did, I think most of all, more than these two personalities, my first reading of the Bhagavad Gita exposed me to what is right and what is wrong, what is dharma and adharma. And I categorized the apartheid regime as an adharmic regime. And therefore, I had to join those forces that fought it. And that's why the major part of our youth was with those liberation organizations that worked against dismantling this unjust regime. So that's the background I came from. But of course, I had to look back to my own history. And my history is in many sense the history of the relationship between India and South Africa. Very often when you think of India and South Africa, there's one major figure that defines this relationship, and that's Gandhi, because of the 21 years that he spent in South Africa. But Gandhi was not the catalyst in terms of how you define the relationship between our two countries in the more recent period. It was the arrival of Indians in South Africa under the British indenture system, which started in 1860 and lasted until 1911, when it was abolished in South Africa, and eventually 1917, when it was ultimately abolished as a system of bonded labor. So between that period of 1860 to 1911, 152,000 Indians moved from India to South Africa, and basically from four provinces, from Bihar, UP in the north, and from Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh in the south. So my ancestors went there to work on the sugar plantations. My great-grandfather arrived in South Africa in January 1893 and was assigned to a sugar plantation. If you're familiar with South Africa, the city of Durban, if you watch cricket, you know Durban. And it was a small town in southern Durban. He was assigned to a farm there where he worked on the sugar plantations. That's my history. But it's the history of the majority of South Africans. So when you look at the history of South African Indians, there are three streams. And in a way, it's unique because you had the indentured Indians that went. And then after the 5-year period of indenture, most Indians decided to remain in South Africa, and they went into farming and other sorts of vocations. So you had a thriving Indian community already by the time that Gandhi arrived. Gandhi also arrived in 1893. But Gandhi was a second stream of Indians that started arriving in South Africa, the professional class. Those that came there as doctors, as lawyers, as accountants, to service the already enlarged and settled Indian community. And then, of course, business people will go everywhere where they can make money. So then you had another stream also coming because there was a chance here to get into business with the local community. So these two streams of the professional class came in the main from Gujarat. So that added a fifth strain into South African society. So if you look at South African Indian community, by and large, they are of Tamil descent, Andhra descent, Hindi speaking, and Gujarati speaking. And that's the nature of South African society. We are a country of 66 million and 1.7 million of Indian origin. And there's about 600,000 now of what we call the NRI Indians that have come post the apartheid period. Now, Gandhi coming to South Africa was important in terms of the transformative impact it had, not just on the Indian community that was already there, but I think on South African society as a whole. I have argued, and I've said this to scholars and both here in South Africa, we need to do a bit more research because you must remember that the movement of Indians to South Africa started in 1860. But in 1857, you had the first war of independence in India. And if you look at all of those villages from where Indians left to go to South Africa, nearly all of them were part of that first war of independence. My theory, and I'm sure I'm not wrong, is that many of them were impacted by the failed first war of independence and the fury that was unleashed by the British against those that took part in this event. And many of them would have wanted to leave. And many of them, or the majority of them, would have been highly politicized because they would have experienced the wrath of discrimination and the manner in which they were treated by the British colonial masters. And they went to South Africa thinking it's better life there. But they went from one hellhole into a bigger hellhole because conditions in South Africa were even worse. And not much research has been done in terms of this. So Gandhi, when he arrived in 1893, within a year, he created the first political party, the Natal Indian Congress. He recognized the need to organize the Indian community there and to collectively agitate against the system and the treatment they were being meted out. So Gandhi could not have done that if he didn't have a highly politicized audience already. And that's why the Natal Indian Congress was the first political structure formed in South Africa and the African continent, the first organized. Very often we speak of the African National Congress. Until the last elections, I keep saying the governing party. Well, they are still the majority in the current government of national unity following our elections last year. But the African National Congress was founded in 1912. This party was founded in 1894, a good few years before that. But it did directly impact on the larger South African population that was agitating against colonial rule and also institutionalized apartheid that came a bit later. So that's the background. I know it's a long background I'm giving you, but I thought you understand that's what framed the relationship between our two countries. Now, I keep asking the question. In 1893, the merchant who wrote to Gandhi and said, please come defend my case, had he not fallen into difficult times and had the need for a lawyer to come and defend him, he would not have written to Gandhi, and Gandhi would not have gone to South Africa. Perhaps he went there as a young barrister, and he spent the next 21 years there. His first ashrams were developed in South Africa. So what you had, Gandhi had a transformative impact on the South African community, Indian and the larger community. But South Africa had a transformative impact on Gandhi because Gandhi was transformed from a lawyer into what became a freedom fighter and philosopher. Because it was in South Africa. South Africa was the laboratory that provided Gandhi the platform to go within himself and question the value and purpose of life. And in that process, he developed Ahimsa and Satyagraha on South African soil based on what he experienced in South Africa. So I keep saying that in many senses, as much as you helped us in our liberation struggle, we did also play a role in your own liberation by transforming that Gandhi into a freedom fighter when he arrived back in India in 1915, after 21 years in South Africa. He was already politically a right person in terms of playing a catalytic role in your freedom struggle. So had Gandhi not gone to South Africa, how would your freedom struggle pan out? Perhaps differently. So I'm saying this history is so interlinked in terms of the Indian community, in terms of Gandhi, and the role that you subsequently played. India played an important role in our freedom struggle. You were the first country, as early as 1946, even before you gained your own independence. You imposed economic sanctions against South Africa. You were the country to first call for comprehensive sanctions against South Africa within the United Nations system. You raised the plight of South Africa within the UN. And from economic sanctions, you imposed comprehensive sanctions. Political, economic, sporting, cultural, we couldn't play cricket with you in all these years. The first cricket match that took place after we became a democracy was between India and South Africa. And it had to be. We took a decision, it had to be between India, because India started the isolation of South Africa on the sporting arena. So you played such an important role in our own liberation, but at the same time, we also had an impact on your liberation. That's the history. So it was natural that when we became a democracy, to set a platform and foundation for this bilateral relationship, it was very easy. Because I keep saying it's a relationship forged in struggle, a common struggle that we both experienced. And we are both countries of the global south and have similar experiences. So in 1993, the decision was taken to establish formal bilateral relations. The documents were signed late 1993. And in April 94, we opened a High Commission here. And in May 94, you opened the High Commission in Pretoria. Of course, I'm not going to go into the history of that relationship. Like all bilateral relationship, it has flourished. We've had many high-level visits between your prime ministers, your president, and between our presidents, ministerial visits over the past 30 years. We observed 30 years of diplomatic relations last year and celebrated that event. So on the bilateral relations, it's a sound footing. We have signed a large number of agreements. Mandela came here in 1992, before he took over the presidency of South Africa, to personally thank India for the role that you played in our liberation struggle. And he returned in 1995 when he was the chief guest of your Republic Day. And it was during that time, in 1995, that the idea came to him while here in India that we need to create an organization that brings the littoral states of the Indian Ocean together. So the birth of the Indian Ocean Rim Association took place here in Delhi. It was Mandela who suggested that we create this organization, and 2 years later it was formally launched. Our trade has grown substantially. It's about, according to South African figures, it's about $13 billion two-way trade. According to Indian figures, it's $19 billion. We don't add in the gold figures. South Africa is a major producer of gold to India, but gold goes through a third country, so it's not added into our figures, but India adds it. So be it 13 or 19 billion, it has grown substantially. But I personally believe the potential between our two countries is vast, and this current trade figures is really very modest, very modest. So I think there's a vast scope to substantially increase trade relations and investment relations between our two countries. We have about 130 plus Indian companies that are resident in South Africa and about 20-25 South African companies that are resident in India. So the scope for expanding the trade, investment, economic relations is vast. On the sporting front, I think we have done very well. We continue to be good rivals. We let you win the last T20. We almost beat you. But I think we have that dynamic relationship on the sporting people-to-people front. Cultural relations, that continues very strongly. One of the unforeseen consequences of sanctions against South Africa is that we as an Indian community, we were isolated from India. Between 1946 to 92, I would say, even though we got democracy, after the release of Mandela and when you had the unbanning of political parties, you had a free flow of people between our two countries. But almost my entire youth, India was one of those countries that were sanctioned, and you could not have the free flow of Indians. The university that I taught at, where I studied and taught at, my wife as well, she studied and taught there. It was, as I said, a totally Indian university. We had no choice. We had to attend that university. And I became a lecturer there. And they had a department of Tamil, Urdu, Hindi, and Telugu. But we could not have a teacher from India, because India wouldn't allow academics to come to South Africa. I'm just using that. We had a department of Sanskrit. We could not get a teacher from India to teach Sanskrit. And yet we had the department of Urdu, Persian, and Arabic. They had academic from Pakistan teaching there because there was no sanctions from Pakistan. Just to give you some idea of how sanctions panned out and the indirect consequence of isolating the Indian community. We could not have priests to come to South Africa to train our priests. And there's about 300 temples in South Africa to be a pujari at the temple. Because over the period of time, this was eroded. And you'll see much of the practices that we had was what we inherited from our great-great-grandparents. But because that was not replenished and there was not cross-cultural movement of people from India to South Africa, we struggled in terms. So we had to produce our own priests. So you'd see some deviation in the way we do puja and you do puja, for example. We had to improvise. I mean, you'll see Indian food in South Africa is different from Indian food in India because we have Africanized our Indian curries to some extent. So these were some of the unforeseen consequences. Where's the relationship today? It's a strong relationship bilaterally, but we can do much better. It's not where it should be. It can be in a far better space. And I think both sides need some introspection. Perhaps after 30 years, we need a pause moment to introspect and see what are the strengths of this relationship. And there are many weaknesses. I'm not going to go into that. There are many weaknesses in this relationship. It can be at a much better place than where it is at the present time. And I hope during my tenure here, I will get that opportunity to plug in those weaknesses and try and address some of the challenges we have. On the multilateral front, we work very well together. We are partners within the UN system. We have basically the same values and the same goals in terms of what is happening in the current UN architecture. The very purposes and principles of the UN Charter is all thrown out of the window. If you read the preamble of the UN Charter, you will see that we are violating just the very principles that outlines what the Charter should be. So today, unfortunately, the UN Charter, its purposes and principles that brought us together after the traumatic events of 1945 and welded us into a global community under the banner of the United Nations from the League of Nations, is totally out of the window. I mean, it's a tragedy today that the Secretary General hardly has any gravity. It's a tragedy today that the UNSC cannot intervene, which is its main purpose is to intervene in times of crisis. It cannot do anything. And I say anything, it's not an exaggeration. the Russia-Ukraine situation, what is happening in Sudan today, what is happening in Gaza. Well, fortunately, there's some kind of truce in Gaza at the moment. But it couldn't intervene there because no one respects UNSC resolutions anymore. So the whole UN architecture has been eroded to a point that it's what I can only call a tragedy. The whole UN system is, I should previously say, it's semi-paralyzed. The term I copied from Celso Amorim, the former foreign minister of Brazil and current advisor to President Lula, when speaking, I think about 10 years ago, about what was still the Doha round of negotiations under the WTO. And there was no movement on that process. And when he was asked why, he said, because we have padlocked this process, it's paralyzed, and we have thrown the keys away. And basically, that's what we have done to the UN architecture today. And what is unfortunately unfolding in terms of Trump 2.0, I think is something should concern all of us at the moment in terms of the impact it's going to have on the global multilateral system, be it the World Health Organization, the WTO, the UN system in itself, and I think the global financial architecture, your Bretton Woods institution, all of these, I think we're going to have serious challenges. The UN DPKO, peacekeeping forces, and its implications for global peace. I think all of these are going to be challenges. But I think India and South Africa and other like-minded countries from both the global north and south, we have to work together to preserve this architecture. Of course, we can't preserve the architecture as it exists. As Antonio Guterres said 2 years ago when he was at the G7 summit and when he came to the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, the UNSC is an obsolete, outdated, irrelevant entity today. It needs serious reform. And he also said the G7 should be more sensitive to the needs of the global south. Now, he said this 2 years ago. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. But we have no choice. We have to ensure that we preserve the UN system, the UN Charter, its purpose and principles, but a reformed United Nations system, a reformed Security Council. Your P5 today may be powerful, but your P5 today has no teeth. No one respects. It's divided into a P3 and a P2. We know that as a fact, right? Sanctions today are no longer coming from the UNSC. Unilateral sanctions have overtaken UNSC sanctions, and many of us are hurt by these sanctions. Through secondary sanctions are hurting all of us. But this is the world we live in. COVID gave us an opportunity to close the divide between North and South, but all it did was deepen the divide between the North and South, not in terms of just how we interacted in response to the pandemic, but the political response and the economic response. The fallout from the pandemic on both fronts was far more deeper than just the human loss of life through the pandemic. And I think that is why in 2003, we saw quite early, very recently, I saw someone questioning Minister Jaishankar on why we have BRICS. I was asked this question in Berlin in, I think, 2016. I was invited to a conference in Berlin to speak on BRICS. And during the interactive, someone in the audience got up and asked me, why did you have to create BRICS? And then I said, let me put the question to you. You tell me why you had to create G7 or G8 and then made it back to G7. If you tell me that, then you'll understand why we created the BRICS. So, of course, BRICS is an important entity. Very early we recognized, and if you look at the World Bank report, you know, Jim O'Neill takes credit for coining this term, this acronym BRIC, not BRICS, BRIC. And if you look at the World Bank report of 1998, they speak of certain EMDCs that need to be on the watch list. And it included all of the BRICS countries, as well as Indonesia. But by the time Jim O'Neill came up with this term, Indonesia had internal revolt, political crisis, so he conveniently left Indonesia out. But Indonesia, rightly, was one of those countries that was also bubbling at the turn of the century. And in all of these countries, there were dramatic processes underway. You had Putin coming back to power. Lula came back to power after Cardoso set them back on track after the crisis they had in the late 70s and early 80s. But Cardoso set them on track. Lula brought them back to the fore, and Lula's term stabilized Brazil. Putin, after the wobbly period of the vodka period of Russia that it went after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the USSR, you had a period of instability in the newly emerged Russian Federation. It was Putin that came and brought it back to the fore. And you saw the same happening in India. You had dramatic changes after Narasimha Rao's reforms. Manmohan Singh, finance minister, then put you back on track. China was on its way on a new path post the period of Deng Xiaoping and the 1978 opening up and reform of China. So all of these countries, there were dramatic changes, including in Africa, because by the time of the turn of the millennium, Africa was also changing. By then, the last of the countries that was under bondage, South Africa was free, although we still say we need to deal with the Sahrawi situation. But by and large, as I keep reminding ourselves that when the OAU was founded in 1963, only 32 of the 54 African countries were sovereign independent states, only 32, as recently as 1963. So at the turn of the millennium, Africa was also charting a new path. It moved from the OAU to the AU at the summit that took place in Durban. I was privileged to be part of that transition. And the AU started charting a new path. But I keep reminding people that The Economist, the cover of The Economist, as early as just not too long ago, 2000, I think it was May 2000, the front cover referred to Africa as the hopeless continent. 11 years later, the same Economist, the front cover had Africa as the continent of hope. So what happened in this 11 years? So Africa was also transiting, and we, of course, embarked on a new template. We launched NEPAD. I can give you a story of the history of NEPAD, but we'll leave that for another time. I was very privileged to be part of that process that brought us to NEPAD. The new Partnership for Africa's Development, which became the flagship development project of the African continent and is part now of the AU's Agenda 2063. So I think on the multilateral front, India has been a great friend of the global south of Africa. As early as 1955, the first Bandung Conference, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the architects of that conference, the first Asia-African conference that took place in Bandung that spoke of Asia-Africa solidarity and the Panchsheel, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And as you know, that was the forerunner of the NAM. NAM was founded soon after the Bandung Conference. Following NAM, you had the launch of G77 and later on plus China. And these were important developments where India was at the forefront working with Africa. So I think we had, on the multilateral front, we have a common template. We have a common challenge at the present time. We are partners in IPSA. We saw the need to create an IPSA as early as 2003. And what are the principles that brought us together in IPSA? Those principles are of fundamental importance today. First and foremost is defending the UN system, the values of democracy, of multilateralism, of freedom of speech, human rights, advancing the development agenda. And that's why we created, soon after I've been occupying all these portfolios. I led South Africa's first senior officials delegation to Brasilia. That was the forerunner to launching of IPSA, the ministerial, in 2003. Now, we all had great hopes. We are fired up. I know when I went to Parliament to give a report on IPSA, one of our parliamentarians said, "You've just not launched IPSA. You have launched a powerful bloc of countries." And that was just the 3. And a few years later, when BRICS came together, you have this powerful group. Now, when I'm asked this question, why you created BRICS. Now take away BRICS from the current global architecture, geopolitical architecture. Imagine there's no BRICS. Who would be championing the global south? This year, G7 marks 50 years of its founding. It was founded in 1975. It was still G6 then at its founding. Canada joined the next year. They will mark 50 years that they're in existence. BRICS started meeting on the margins of UNGA at a ministerial level, and then you had the first summit in 2009 in Russia. But today, BRICS is recognized as a force of the global south. Now, if you didn't have that, where would you have this weightiness? Even now, when you speak of the G20, within BRICS, within the G20, BRICS is a powerful grouping. And I think India and South Africa has been party to these kind of new multilateral fora that are playing a critical role in trying to bring balance in this world. And I think it's important we strengthen these formations. I said 2 days ago, I left the role of BRICS Sherpa. I had it for about 12 years. I've been at 12 consecutive summits, and I've seen BRICS grow. And when I left it, my last job was to oversee the expansion. And I left very optimistic that this is a powerful formation, a formation for good in terms of addressing the global challenges, not just of the global south, but playing a role in redesigning a new global architecture that is inclusive and that truly leaves no one behind, not at the individual level, not at the country level. And I think we have countries like India, and I think you did a remarkable job when you chaired the G20. I said to some colleagues, for me, there were several takeaways from India's G20, but that's for another lecture, Prof. Otherwise, I'll continue non-stop here. But I think when I looked at what was happening within G20, and maybe I read too much into pictures, but one of the things I did, my first job in life was an art teacher. I hold a diploma in fine arts. So I studied photography. And I can read one of the things, a course I had to do was art appreciation. I had to look at a painting and analyze it. What was the artist thinking? And why has the Mona Lisa got a smile? Or does she have a smile? So I look into things from that perspective as well. And when I looked at the last G20 family photo, I know few heads of state didn't turn up for the photo. Some said they were busy with bilaterals and others didn't give reasons. But if you look at the family photo of the G20 from the first summit in 2008 to the last summit in Rio last year, you go and look at it and see if you see anything into it. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it politically. But what you see over the years is there's always been a scramble to be on the front row. When I was Sherpa, Trump was in the presidency. So it was very interesting to be in the presidency, to be in the BRICS G20 summit during Trump's, for that entire 4 years that he was president, I was the Sherpa. I was also the Sherpa the last year. I'll give you a short story. The last year of when we knew Obama is leaving and Trump is coming, when I was at the Russian summit, I wasn't Sherpa then, but I was the BRICS Sherpa, and I had to go there because we have a meeting of BRICS leaders on the margins of G20 to prepare the G20 agenda. So I think it was 2013, if I recall, that I went there. And Obama came and everyone was behind Obama. I'm talking about global leaders. And when it was his last year and everyone knew he was going, he was sitting alone. No one was even going near him. That's how power is relative. When I sat there watching the inauguration of Trump and Biden sitting just a few feet of him, and he's verbally undoing everything that Biden enacted during his period in front of him. And I was telling to Nilistra, this is what power is. A few minutes ago, he was the most powerful person in the world. And yet today he's powerless, watching all that he built over the past 4 years being unraveled in front of him. So, we live in a world of power today. Power is defined differently. Power is defined in terms of your political power. Power is defined in terms of your military power. Power is defined in terms of your economic power. Economic power plays a major, major role. India can flex its muscles today because you're a $4 trillion economy. China can flex its muscles today because it's a $19 trillion economy. The USA continues to flex its muscles most because it's a $30 trillion economy. But it's not just about the economy. Today, technology is also a powerful weapon. And that's also another statement of power. But so is population. You know, I studied Indian Asian history. My major was what was called Oriental Studies. And under the apartheid regime, Asia was not thought as part of history. It was not seen as part of history. So we had a course on history, which focused on Western history and a bit of African history, but no Asian history at all. Asian history was taught under a course called Oriental Studies. And of course, as I told you, my love for Asia, so I went to do that course. But fortunately, I majored in history of art, and through history of art, I had to study Western history as well. So I had both sides of the coin. But when they spoke of India and China, they spoke of India and China as overpopulated, underdeveloped, poor countries. Today, when President Xi speaks of China, he speaks of China as 1.4 billion strong. When Prime Minister Modi speaks of India, he keeps mentioning, how many crore? I'm still not very familiar. 1.5 crore, almost 1.5 crore. And that's a statement of power today. But in the 80s, it was a statement of poverty. So I'm saying the world is changing dramatically. Language is changing dramatically. In my time, they spoke of first world and third world. Now we speak of north and south. And even this north and south is blurred now because there's no longer strict lines marking north and south. If you look at formations like the Quad and IPEF and all of this, it's north and south together. And this is, I say we live in an age of multi-alignments. And that is going to characterize this. I gave a lecture in South Africa late 2019. There's a think tank called Mistra. And I said this decade of the 2020 will be characterized by several C's. It will be characterized by greater cooperation because we are a shrunk world through globalization. It will be characterized by greater competition because you have rise of new economic powers that's also jostling for markets. You'll have greater contestation. And fourthly, I said you'll have greater conflict in this decade. And I've not been proved wrong on all four of these points. I said this in 2019. And this is what is characterizing this decade and will continue to characterize this decade. What is the role of India, South Africa in this? I think as countries of the global South, we have a common agenda. We have to provide leadership. Leadership in terms of crafting the new global architecture will come from the global South. You have shown it during your G20 presidency, but it is also the magnanimity of the global South, by and large, I'd say 95%. I'm going to leave 5% out because you read into what I'm saying. By and large, the global South have not gone out and colonized or enslaved humanity. The global South has always had a broader thinking in terms of being inclusive. And it is this global South that must be inclusive, despite the pain caused to us by the many in the global North. When Mandela came out of prison, he wasn't vindictive for the 27 years of his life that they robbed him from. He forgave. And for him, the bigger picture was to build an inclusive South Africa. Being vindictive would not get us anywhere. It will take us backward. So I'm saying countries like India and South Africa, Brazil and others, we have a role to play in the current period. And we need to be more assertive and we must show leadership. Let me leave it there. I've not quite stuck to the topic, but thank you.
Excellency, this was quite a melding of the personal and the political and I think toward the horizon of India-South Africa relationship as it has evolved historically and of course in the contemporary realm. I have some questions I want to raise as taking the privilege as a chair, but then I'll open this up for audience as well. One of the things that you touched upon, and I think we are all grappling with, is this idea of great power competition, contestation. How do you think, and particularly now with Mr. Trump in office, and an expectation that perhaps the US-China relationship might become more adversarial, although we are not sure yet. I mean, he has made all kinds of statements on the issue. But by and large, the great power game, if you look at the last few years, have become more contested. The space has become more contested. How does South Africa as a country and Africa as a continent, of course, it's a huge one, and I don't want you to take on the mantle of speaking on behalf of Africa, but I think it's an important geography where we will see increasing contestation being played out. So how does a continent that itself is rising in terms of confidence, in terms of economic growth, in terms of demography, how does it play this duality of great power politics, and where does it find its role and niche in that very, very contested space that we are witnessing increasingly? Is there a vision from South Africa? Is there a vision from Africa that we are going to see on that very, very difficult issue? Or is it something that I think, as most of us are, Africa and South Africa are still grappling with?
I think, Prof, great power contestation is going to be with us for quite some time. And I don't think we've got into the epicenter of it yet. I think we're still to come into the epicenter of that. I don't know if Trump will lead us there. Perhaps not. Depends how it pans out. Depends also, I've had the privilege of dealing with China for a long time. I've traveled to China extensively for over 30 years, as I have for over 40 years traveled in this country. And China has also changed in the past, as you have changed dramatically over the past 10, 15 years. Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the CCP in 2013. 2014, he became president. I've been at all the summits, BRICS summits, and in one-on-ones many, many times with our past three presidents, with President Xi, as I've been with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and many, many times with Prime Minister Modi. I think the difference in Hu Jintao's China and Xi Jinping's China is that Hu Jintao spoke of the peaceful rise of China. I don't think China believes in the peaceful rise of China anymore under Xi Jinping. At the last party congress, I think it was October year before last, he made it very clear. He sounded so much like Trump. When I was comparing, I'm very often called by CCTV to comment when they have these things. And I was asked to comment on that. And specifically, he made it very clear that they will take back Taiwan. Now, what was Trump saying? They're going to take back Panama Canal? How different is that? So they perhaps are two sides of the same coin in terms of the way they see the world. It's an expansionist worldview. And this, in a sense, is problematic because you have an assertive China that feels that it's being not given the space to rise. I mean, China has seen what the USA did to Japan to contain Japan's economic rise. There was a time when Japan's economy, when it was like China's, growing at double digits. 60s and 70s, Japan was racing, almost catching up the US economy. And there was a political decision they will not allow that to happen. Like Trump is saying now, we will not allow China to overtake us economically and otherwise. So there's so many templates that you can see repeating itself. I know that they have spoken about working with India and helping India. This was said by Clinton, by Obama, to become a great power. But as you become more and more powerful and your economy grows, I'm not sure just how much support will be forthcoming when they start seeing you as rivals as well. So I think great power competition is something that we have to live with and contend with. But I think for now we have to learn to contain it. And I think middle power countries like South Africa, Indonesia, and others, and emerging major powers like yourselves from the global south that don't have global hegemony as an agenda have a role to play. Because, I keep repeating the question asked at the BRICS summit in South Africa by the late President Hage Geingob of Namibia. When he made his intervention, he ended his intervention by asking a question to President Ramaphosa. And we had about 60 plus countries there. It was the BRICS plus meeting. About 65 countries in the room and about 40 plus heads of state. He asked the question, what guarantee do we have that you, speaking to the five of us, that as you become global powers, you don't start treating us like the powers that enslaved us? He asked that question too. And I thought it was a very befitting question because there's that anxiety. Because as you rise, your behavior and posture on the global stage starts changing. I've seen it with China. As I said, when I first went to China, I've seen poor China. And I've seen powerful China. Posture have changed, language has changed, and ambitions have changed. Now, I see a bit of that creeping in India as well. I want to be very frank with you, and I keep reminding my Indian friends, don't let the arrogance of power get to you, like what has happened with our colleagues from the north, that prior to the Industrial Revolution were poor countries. They took the wealth from India and China, colonizing, and through the wealth that was drained. Shashi Tharoor, he speaks very openly. There are many books written on this. India wasn't a poverty-stricken country. India and China, up to 1810, ruled the global economic space. And that's where as a student of history, I keep saying history repeats itself. This is a common phrase. But look at history. Look at history. So the rise of India and China is natural. It's natural that you will become two of the most powerful countries in this world by the turn of this century. Our president should always speak of the African century, that this century will be the African century. And I've always said it should be the Asian African century, which it will be, for many reasons. So I think getting back to your question, great power contestation is going to be with us for some time. But I think it's countries like ours that needs to be the bridge builders. You showed that you can be a bridge builder. I said to many colleagues, following what happened to the BRICS summit under Indonesia, the Russians were very upset because you had language in the Jakarta Declaration that finger-pointed on Russia and the Ukraine crisis. The Russian Sherpa told me, never again will you see language like that in any G20 declaration. And given that they struggle to get ministerial outcome documents, both in Indonesia and even during your presidency, some of the ministerials, you couldn't get an outcome document because of the fractious issue of Russia, Ukraine, and a few other areas, including UNSC reform. I believe that we can't avoid the situation we find ourselves in. It's going to deepen. Perhaps, I don't think Trump will take a soft line with China. He did say that he will visit both India and China. But I think you're going to find that they're not going to give China the space to grow, and especially in technology. I think you'll see more sanctions. Perhaps also on the economic front, you'll see more sanctions. And that's my experience with Xi, he doesn't shy away from a fight. He wants a fight. And so does Putin. So does Trump. Trump wants a fight. He's like a boxer in a ring. He doesn't walk away, right? So you have strong leaders that all of the same temperament. Is it going to be possible to get them together and find a middle ground? Perhaps that's the role countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, and others have to play. Africa, in all of this, I laugh because in the first period of Trump's presidency, he basically wrote off the continent. It's like non-existent for him. And he used some unfortunate words to describe the African continent when speaking of Africa. Africa will continue to be an important battleground for the major powers because of Africa's resources, and especially critical minerals. And in terms of how new technology is going to shape global geopolitics, Africa is very critical. But Africa is still weak. We are still weak. Your GDP is bigger than the combined GDP of the continent. That will give you perspective. We still have a number of challenges, but we are doing a number of things right that have put us on the right path. As I referred to earlier on, the AU, the Pan-African Parliament, other structures that have been created, NEPAD, and more recently, Agenda 2063 and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think, can be a catalyst for major change in advancing Africa's development. But Africa needs partners that have their development goals in their vision as well, but not seeing Africa just as a provider of raw materials and being a proxy in this major power contestation. And unfortunately, that's what's happening. And because Africa is in need of assistance, we are a bit vulnerable. I think I'm being diplomatic by saying a bit vulnerable, because we are being taken advantage of. But you are seeing a more assertive Africa. You saw this in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war, when African countries were being forced to take sides, and most of the African countries didn't. They stood up. They stood up and aired their views. And by and large, Africa has adopted your posture of strategic neutrality in terms of not getting directly involved in this. And I think that's what South Africa's position is also on these issues of strategic non-alignment. We don't want to fall into one power camp or the other, because that will further deepen the divide. But more importantly, it will be devastating for us. It will be devastating for us, because they say when the elephant stamps the ground, it's the grass that's hurt most, not the elephant. So I'm saying we live in a gray area. I've said this for many years now. It's very difficult to see past the fog. It's almost like Delhi weather when you get up in the morning. It's difficult to see outside and see what's going on. And I think at the present time, we live in that period in terms of global geopolitics and the global security architecture. It's very difficult to predict, and Trump can be a major catalyst for some positive change, or it can deepen the divide.
So before I just invite others to join in, Excellency, one question that flows from your analysis and that you have touched upon in your intervention as well is about the state of multilateralism. And of course, what Mr. Trump has been doing since coming to office also, I think, underscores the challenge that multilateral institutions are facing. And if you juxtapose that with with all the Sherpa roles that you have performed, BRICS, G20, IPSA, etc., it tells you another story, that there are minilaterals, plurilaterals that are emerging and perhaps trying to fill that void. Now, how, given your experience in this realm, how confident are you that these minilaterals have that potential to fill that void, and how pessimistic are you about the state of multilateral institutions at the moment? Of course, you've spoken about it, but I'm asking you in the context of that many of these minilaterals also have not really performed much. For example, IPSA, for example, still is underperforming. And now that BRICS is gaining greater salience, I think there is also this danger that perhaps IPSA might get eclipsed completely. So, are you optimistic about the state of these institutions, of these minilaterals, and how do we then look at global governance as an enterprise where some of the conflicts that we have talked about can be managed better?
Look, let me say at the very outset, I'm a fan of the United Nations. I spent 4 months as an intern in Geneva, and my first posting after I joined the South African government in '95 was in Geneva. And I firmly believe take away the UN system, what do we have? where a country the size of Vanuatu or Fiji can sit at the same table with the USA or with the European Union. What else do we have? It is still the League of Nations, as it was called, that we have today. And we have no alternative. And I can't see any alternative in sight, nor is anyone interested. So sometimes they say you can't fix a broken organization. But I think in the present circumstances, we have no choice but to fix a broken organization. So we have to safeguard the multilateral architecture and ensure that it's reformed. What you have seen is a disengagement, first from the global north. It's the global north that has paralyzed the multilateral architecture. And now joined by some of us in the south as well, that unfortunately is behaving in a manner that don't want to advance the reform agenda. After 20 years, the working group on Security Council reform have achieved nothing. We're running on the same spot. We're running on the same spot because the P5 don't want reform, even though I'm not sure what value this P5 have anymore in a structure that doesn't work. You know, way back in 2000, we had a strategic planning session in our department. And for the first time, I used this term, unilateralism and the rise of unilateralism. And our foreign secretary told me, what do you mean by this term? I haven't heard this term. And I said, there's a need for smaller structures to buttress the larger structure that's shaking. So when IPSA was formed, it was precisely because we saw what was happening to the multilateral edifice. When BRICS and the other formations that you have, I think all of these are positive developments. In our vision document for our presidency of the G20, we say that the G20 is there to strengthen multilateralism, to strengthen the Bretton Woods architecture, to strengthen the WTO and other multilateral institutions. It's not a replacement. It can never be a replacement. It can't be that 20 countries, 19 plus 2 regional organizations sit around the table and decides what in the best interest of 193 UN member states. It can't be. But it's an important catalyst. Because you have paralysis in the global organization, we have to come together. And that was the reasoning. After the 97-98 financial crisis, you decided to bring the major economy finance ministers together to give direction. And following the 2008 financial crisis in Europe, you decided to elevate rightly to a summit level, the G20. And the G20, I said this, the G20 is also now on shaky grounds. I'm not being alarmist, because the current global geopolitical environment seeps into the G20. It plays out there. You know, when I became Sherpa, one of my colleagues in briefing me in the handover was saying, South Africa must speak up about agenda creep. There's this agenda creep happening in G20. It's supposed to be the preeminent organization tasked with addressing the global financial architecture, global geoeconomics. But now we're talking about health, we're talking about climate change and everything else. And following the summit in Russia, you brought in the Syria crisis. Because remember, Obama was on the verge of bombing the Assad regime. And it was that G20 meeting in Russia, in St. Petersburg, I was there, that stopped that bombardment of the Assad regime by the USA. So you brought in security and geopolitics. We have no choice. I didn't, when I sat at my G20 first Sherpa meeting and I listened, I said, I'm not going to come here and embarrass myself. You can't stop this. The world is integrated. You can't speak of politics, economics, climate change, global health issues, AI, as if they exist in separate compartments. They all interrelated and impact and color each other today. That's the world we live in. So I'm saying, Ambassador, these unilateral fora that have been created, and you have, as I said, a proliferation of these. You can't stop it, you're going to have even more. Whether it's your BRICS, whether it's your AUKUS, whether it's your Quad, whether it's your IPEF, or all these other formations, I2, U2, and others, countries at heart have to take care of their national interest. And you have to find ways and means of taking care of your national interest, your regional interest, and also globally what we can do. So for me, these formations are important formations. They're not detracting from the current multilateral system. I believe they are there to support and buttress that system. And we have to buttress that system until such time we can have those foundations solid again.
Thank you. Let me invite your questions, comments, observations. I have lots of hands here. I'll start from the back, if I may.
Good afternoon, Your Excellency. I'm Danny Antonio Martin. I'm from Amity Institute of International Studies. My question was that, considering that South Africa houses one of the world's most critical maritime choke points, the Cape of Good Hope, could we potentially see any further defense engagements with India? For instance, could the purchase of BrahMos missile system not only diversify the arsenal of South Africa, but also strengthen the BRICS partnership?
Good evening, Excellency, and everyone present in the hall. So my name is Ashutosh. I'm a consultant in the private sector and also follower of international relations. My question to you is, how do you view the BRICS Plus? You spoke of BRICS, but the BRICS is quite expanding now. And also your views on the Quad, as I believe that South Africa also have a role to play in Indo-Pacific. So how do you view Quad and BRICS Plus? Thank you.
Good evening, sir. My name is Vidushi Sinha. Thank you so much for that, for the dialogue, for the conversation. I was particularly intrigued by how you brought in art, culture, and society and sort of weighed it with politics. But my question doesn't fall under that category. As South Africa gears up for its upcoming G20 presidency this year, helming such a critical dialogue, would you agree the assumption of this leadership role entails a form of unspoken responsibility to address President Zelensky's rather explicit appeal for international assistance from global South leaders like India and South Africa? Would you say the cost of establishing long-term peace amidst this crisis means somewhat nudging the concrete ground of neutrality that South Africa so proudly stands behind? My intention to pose this question is just to understand how do we balance politics and how do we balance leadership, and how does it translate to not having a response on such a situation, having a neutral response to such a situation? I hope my question's clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you. On the first question, we do have a defense agreement between our two countries. You have a vibrant defense sector, so do we. And we have had discussions. India do buy weapons from South Africa. And we have had discussions on joint production, on looking at collaboration in the defense sector. We collaborate within IPSA on IPSAMA, where we have naval exercises every 2 years, alternating. The last one was in Simonstown, which is off the coast of Cape Town, where the three countries come together to practice. So I think this is one of the areas that we are focused on in terms of deepening collaboration on the defense sector, in terms of mutual cooperation for both sides. I think it's important countries from the global south become more and more autonomous in terms of defense and armament going forward. And I think India is on that track. We are also on the same page. The question on BRICS Plus, I think expansion of BRICS is good for BRICS. I said this previously. I left the Sherpa role with the admittance of 4 new members, and invitations were sent out to 2 others. One has subsequently joined. You've seen Indonesia now has become a full member. Saudi has been invited. They haven't responded. And I think now at the last count, there are 9 partner countries. Nigeria has just joined. So you have what for me is a much more powerful BRICS. Of course, internally, we'll have to learn to coordinate. For many years, it was the 5 of us. So to interact and find consensus, because we are a consensus-based organization, it was easier. But as you grow, it becomes a bit more challenging. But I don't think it's a hurdle that can't be overcome. For me, the expansion of BRICS says, when we were starting to look at expansion of BRICS, because it was the 2022 summit, Beijing summit, that tasked Sherpas to go and look at developing standards, criteria, and procedure for expansion. So that was the mandate given at the BRICS summit in 2022. We had 2 meetings under China's chairship, and we didn't make progress because not everyone was on the same page about expansion. So when we took over the chairship, I started chairing that process. And by the middle of that year, when we came to the foreign ministers meeting in Cape Town in June 2023, I gave the ministers a very frank report. I said, we have failed to find consensus in developing standards, criteria, and procedure. And they said, you go back and do your work. We want you to meet and come back within a month with a completed document. So I called an extraordinary BRICS Sherpa meeting in Durban in July 2023, and we had 95% consensus on standard criteria and procedure for expansion, which we handed over to our foreign ministers. Our foreign ministers failed to close that 5%. They closed about 3%. 2% was left open. So the first time ever in BRICS Summit, when the leaders met on the eve of the summit, leaders were negotiating. I've never seen leaders negotiate. But Prime Minister Modi, President Xi, President Ramaphosa, President Lula, all got into negotiations. They had a conversation, and then they said, look, you ministers go back and finish your work. I was very happy because they chastised us for us not completing our work. Now they were given the same treatment. But in the end, we did get consensus at the leaders' level, but it was not an easy process. It was not an easy process. But I think looking back, the expansion of BRICS is a positive dimension. You had about 40 plus countries wanting to come. Very often I would be interviewed, especially by the Western media. Why do you think so many countries want to join BRICS? This sudden rush. I said, we must be doing something right. That's the only reason I can give you. Because if countries have confidence in BRICS, they have confidence in what we have achieved over these past 15 years, they have confidence in the values and principles we ascribe to, and what we are doing. All of these factors have drawn so many countries. And as you saw even last year, 40 plus countries wanted to become part of BRICS. So I think expansion is a positive development for BRICS. It's a more powerful entity today. I mean, just looking at figures, we're almost half of the global population. We are bigger than the G7. We were already bigger than the G7, the 5 of us, in terms of global GDP. We were 31% in 2023, and the G7 was 29%. So we had already overtaken the GDP. And as I said today, economic power is a major factor. So it's much bigger now. It's about 46% in terms of global energy reserves. I think with Nigeria joining, the last count was 46, maybe it's 47%. In terms of global gas reserves, in terms of global population, in terms of global demographics, land mass. It's a powerful entity in every way you look at it. The challenge is, how do we remain coherent and how do we remain consistent in terms of what we set out to achieve as a body of the global South? So I think, but I'm positive that it will move in the right direction. Zelensky, now I think you have to, my first job, as I said, I was an art teacher. But in South Africa, when you were a teacher, you had to teach at least 2 subjects. So I was also an English teacher. There's a difference between neutrality and strategic non-alignment. To say that South Africa is neutral is not correct. When I say we are strategically non-aligned, it doesn't mean we are neutral. So I think, look at the term, what we are saying. Remember, South Africa was part of the group of African countries that went to both Russia and Ukraine. Africa is not, even though we were accused of providing weapons to Russia, but there was nothing in that. It was just, again, to detract from the reality. Who is providing weapons and who is providing funding to fuel this war? The question should be directed to them and not to those countries. China has put what I think a 10-point plan on the table in terms of peace. The African group put a peace plan. Prime Minister Modi has engaged both leaders. President Lula has done the same. in terms of fostering peace and bringing a ceasefire on the table. Which G7 countries have done that? What are they doing? Billions of dollars, while the COVID pushed 100 million people, the majority from Africa, into abject poverty. There's no money for addressing that, but billions of dollars are going into armaments and keeping this going. So I think we must continue to work with those countries that are calling for peace and tell those countries that are fueling the war, either financially or through military equipment, military aid, that this is not going to lead to anything. The Gaza war came to an end, not through a barrel of a gun. The fall of apartheid didn't come to an end because of conflict between the liberation movements and the National Party government. It happened around the table. And that's the only solution. So there is not neutrality in this. As students of international relations, you know this is a complex terrain. So just to categorize into one camp of neutrality and another camp of what some of us call strategic non-alignment, it's not one and the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the brilliant talk, Ambassador. I'm Anushka Saraswat, and I was a part of the working group on human rights during India's G20 presidency, and I'm a lawyer. So my question would probably begin with this fact that I think no one gets a better opportunity to really admire the history of Africa than someone who studied international human rights law. And in this context, my question is that how do you see the vision for South Africa's G20 presidency when it comes to complex issues surrounding, the violation of human rights, probably where a lot of more responsibility is required from the global north when they talk about climate change, but refrain from talking about climate finance. And also, India in its own space has been talking about the right to development in UNHRC, which brings us to the aspect of, how do we attract investments in our countries in Global South? So would you like to speak about that and where probably, people in India can collaborate and India and South Africa can collaborate on some of these issues?
Excellency, very good evening. My name is Dhruv Rampura and I'm a student of law. First of all, thank you so much for that enriching, insightful and a thought-provoking dialogue. A lot of questions. But then one most important thing, and I quote, you said that, just one question, I won't take Excellency much time. You said that the multilateralism is nothing but small structures to buttress the falling larger structure. Do you fear that these small structures, in their attempt to buttress the larger structure, end up forgetting or deviating from the objective with which they were formed in the first place? That is, the objective now becomes to support the structure rather than fulfilling the objectives and the intention with which they were formed in the first place.
Thank you for considering my question. My name is Shresh Sharma. I'm a research intern at Center of Geoeconomics for the Global South. Thank you for the wonderful talk. My question is with regards to the critical minerals, as the critical resources of South Africa, especially in the automobile sector, have been immense in terms of contribution. Example, manganese that South Africa provides is crucial. How do you see the future of critical mineral trade happening out of South Africa and in broad Africa? And to double down on the point that was made by apparently the head of state of Namibia, I believe, what is it that BRICS offers or BRICS will offer that the Bretton Woods system has failed to provide up until now?
Hello, sir. I'm from Amity University of International Studies. And my question is, you talked about the bilateral relationship with India and South Africa and the vast potential it has. So my question is that India can get same opportunities and research from different African countries. What unique opportunities can South Africa provide?
The issue of human rights, it's very close to me. I spent 3 months as an intern in the Center for Human Rights, and I also subsequently did a course. I have a certificate in human rights from the center. But what's happened, what was then called the Human Rights Commission and later now the Human Rights Council, what's happened to human rights within that council today? Is it about human rights? it's become a politicized terrain, unfortunately, because as I said, we live in this interconnected world. So the political environment pollutes what should be focused on human rights as defined by the Charter on Human Rights. That is no more there. And all of us have a different reading. When I speak of all of us, I speak at a country level of what is human rights today. There'll be finger pointing, especially against countries from Africa and the global south, that you are violating all of these. And who are the biggest violators of human rights? Right? You can't deny your history of what you did and still continue in this vein. So I'm saying that it's a very difficult terrain, and the Human Rights Council that functions, that meets twice a year, and its annual sessions, it's more the politicization of the Human Rights Council and each country trying to get at one another. I'll give you the example of the Uyghurs, the treatment of the Uyghurs. So the Europeans and the Americans will annually put out a statement pointing fingers at China and the treatment of the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang district. Then they'll come to all of us to ask us to sign up on that. Some will sign up on the statement by the Western group, and then China will put a counter statement and come to all of us and ask us to sign up to the China statement. So we become pawns in this process. Very much when you speak of major power contestation, it plays out in forums like this. And it's on issue-based issues that become the political tool. So, but we have to continue speaking and strengthening the Human Rights Council and what it stands for, and go back to what the UN Declaration on Human Rights sets out. We've forgotten that declaration, as we have forgotten the purpose and principles of the United Nations. But we have to, countries that fundamentally believe in it. And I think one of the reasons why we created IPSA, because between the three of us, I'm not saying all three of us have fantastic records in human rights, but by and large, we are wedded to the principles of human rights and fundamental freedoms in all its forms. You know, the small states, these small formations, they formed what? They formed because of the larger structure. If they think that the larger structure is irrelevant, they have no relevance themselves. They are only relevant because you have the United Nations there. And that will keep them relevant because of what's happening in the larger structure. Because look at the agenda of the G20, look at the agenda of BRICS, the agenda of G7. It's about the global multilateral architecture, political, security, financial, economic, climate change, now, of course, technology. It's all what's on the multilateral terrain. And they are dealing with it because it's not being dealt effectively there. So they take relevance from that structure. And they'll only remain relevant as long as that architecture is kept intact. So I don't think that the larger structure can be made irrelevant because their relevance is based on that edifice. Now, one of the, we created 5 task forces, as we call it, for the G20 presidency, 3 of which are on our key priorities, and the other 2 is on reform of the global financial architecture, and the last one is on critical minerals. Because critical minerals is such a critical issue today. Now, for Africa, it is very important, and what we do say in our G20 document, it's on the website, is that we must ensure that the development of critical minerals work for the countries, the source countries, and by and large, the countries of the global South. Africa is a major part of that. And it's not just about an extractive economy, but an inclusive economy. We all need these critical minerals. We don't have the technology to transform these minerals into the products that we need for new technologies. But we have to do it in partnership. And that's why I was at a conference 2 years ago in Singapore on critical minerals. It was a conference on Asia and critical minerals, but they invited an African voice. And what I said there is, if the world behaves as they did to Africa in terms of traditional minerals, then Africa is going to be in serious trouble. Because even at the current time, Africa is, I think in terms of world reserves, around 30+% of global minerals. But we are the poorest continent. We have the largest concentration of global wealth in the ground, but we are the poorest because we are seen as extractive economies. Zimbabwe is a rich country in terms of its source. I have to go and give a lecture somewhere now on aid in Africa and what aid has really done to us today. Right? If you look at the wealth of our countries in Africa, we shouldn't be where we are. But our partners have not been partners to us in terms of the development agenda. And where is the development agenda today? We created the development working group within the G20 in 2010, soon after the summit started regularizing under the presidency of South Korea. South Africa was chosen to be a permanent chair, a co-chair of the development working group. I chaired many of those. But part of the challenge, because the G20 is not a legal body, it's a best endeavor body, right? We raise all of these developmental issues, but practically, how are they panning out as a collective of the G20 to address some of these? So I think, look, there's also this whole question of definition. According to the OECD, they identify 17 critical minerals. I've seen on your strategy on critical minerals, India has 33. Now, we in Africa, we haven't even categorized what is the list of critical minerals. We're not there yet, and it differs from country to country. So, but it is a critical area going forward, and it can become a critical area of cooperation rather than, again, exploitation. Bretton Woods institution, the reason why we created the new development bank or the BRICS bank was precisely with the fault lines that you have in the current Bretton Woods institution. I mean, in this day and age, 2025, why must the chairship of the World Bank and IMF be confined to Europeans and Americans? Are we not good enough? Are these not our institutions as well? Are we not also putting resources into these institutions? But we're not good enough to head these things. I thought at the last time when they were looking for a new president, maybe they will look more widely. But this is the world we live in. You know, it's very difficult to give up power. And that's part of the challenge we're going to have in contestation of power. I lived through it. The apartheid regime didn't voluntarily hand over the country to the majority because it came with so many perks and so much of power concentrated on a few. And I keep saying, what happened in South Africa, it's a microcosm of the macrocosm we see today, the contestation of power. So we created the NDB, and the NDB was founded here. The very first meeting to discuss the NDB, it was Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's idea. It was his idea, which he discussed with President Zuma. And they called the first meeting in Delhi. I was here in March 2012 at that meeting. And that's where the NDB was born. It was born here out of the idea of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And the NDB today is an established entity. It's therefore, it's growing. It's also expanding in terms of membership. We have about 5 other countries that have become full-time members. It's continuing to expand because the Global South had to look at its own resources because of the constraints in terms of access to finance for our development. And this is done deliberately. To contain our development, you must have, in order to grow, you must have access to finance, right? The Marshall Plan was created for Europe to give them access, right? To give them access to finance. The IMF and World Bank was created precisely for this reason, so that Europe, after the devastation of the Second World War, could grow and have access to finance. Today, what is the World Bank? What was it called? The International Bank for Reconstruction, I think, IBRD. That was the forerunner of your World Bank today. And it was created precisely so that Europe could have access to funding. But they don't want to give us that funding today because they don't want us to grow. They don't want us to be come like them because they want to occupy the space. So it's that hegemony that we have to fight against. So NDB has been a good story to tell. What was the last question? Was
Avenues of cooperation in India between India and
oh, what other parts of Africa? Look, the whole of Africa has opportunities to offer to India. And I've been saying to my colleagues, the last India-Africa summit took place in 2015. You created a fantastic forum, but for various reasons that has not taken place. Now, I was there in 2015. You're going to think I've been everywhere. But I was also part of the South African delegation at the last India-Africa summit in 2015. And since arriving, and Ambassador here is chair of the SADC group. And we've been raising this. At the last Africa group meeting, this issue was raised. And it is Africa. We're saying we must go to MEA to say we want the summit. So the whole of Africa has opportunities for India as Africa has opportunities here. The reason why South Africa is perhaps the largest trading partner is because we are the largest economy on the continent, with the most diverse economy in the continent, and our infrastructure is perhaps the most developed. It is the most developed. So therefore, trade between our two countries is natural. We're at the same levels of development. Right? India has accelerated now. But that is the reason why you see this. But it's not just about South Africa. India has diversified its trade. At one time, we still occupied the largest share of trade between Africa and India. But that will change. As other African countries rise, it's natural. You will have a more diverse trade with the African continent. But I'm confident trade between India and South Africa will still be a substantial part of India-Africa trade.
Excellency, if you permit me, can I take 5 more minutes and
Sure.
have 2 more interventions?
Sure.
I know there are many more interventions, but I can't give everyone a chance.
Professor, my best audience is when I come to interact with young people and students. Being a former lecturer,
yes,
they say when you interact with young people, they make you younger.
Yes, but there are not so many young people also who are keen to interact. But yes, I think I'll give that, and then one at the back, and then we'll close because we are running out of time.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for the insightful conversation. My question to you is, in your expert opinion, what is the future of the idea which the BRICS nation have adopted for the alternate currency now that President Trump has taken the White House?
Hello, Ambassador and everyone present here. My name is Chavi Chaudhary and I'm a doctoral scholar in Center for African Studies, University of Delhi. So my question is basically on the lines that you significantly talked about the migration of Indians to Africa since colonial times. So my question is, how have colonial era migration policies and socio-political experiences of Indian migrants in Africa shaped their political agency and identity, and what lessons can these histories offer in addressing contemporary challenges of discrimination and inclusion of migrant communities? Thank you.
So since, Excellency, since there are so many students in the audience, I just want to conclude by also asking you, what can we do better in terms of enhancing student exchanges, academic exchanges, think tank exchanges? I think we need to do much more than what we are doing at the moment. And I think that's an area where perhaps your intervention and intervention of other excellencies present here can help in enhancing that youth-to-youth connect, which is very important to take the conversations forward.
On the issue of alternate currency, this came to the fore in 2023, and it was deliberately put into the public domain by some media houses, global media houses. And it came at a time when you had the sudden rush of countries, as I said, 30, 40 countries all wanting to become part of BRICS. So in the media, they put out this statement that BRICS is developing an alternate currency to the dollar. Nowhere in the agenda during South Africa's chairship of BRICS in 2023 was there an agenda item of de-dollarization or BRICS currency. Nowhere in the agenda. We did sign earlier on, I think 2018, 2019, I can't quite recall, the BRICS interbank agreement looking at trading in local currencies. So that was already there in the BRICS architecture of agreement. What the leaders discussed at the summit in Johannesburg and what they tasked us, if you go back to the Johannesburg Summit Declaration, I think it's Article 45, that says that the finance ministers and or central bank governors must examine the use of local currency and developing alternate payment systems and platforms. That was the task given. Nowhere does it mention an alternate currency. Nor has there been up to today a discussion of creating a common BRICS currency. This is deliberately put out into the public media, again, to create unnecessary tensions. So when Trump made that statement that he'll apply 100% sanctions against those BRICS countries working on an alternative, BRICS is not about de-dollarization. And I think Minister Jaishankar issued a statement clearly articulating India's position. And that is the position of all BRICS countries. We have been saying we need to trade in local currencies. Of course, at one stage, we all traded in the dollar because dollar and the USA economy was the most powerful and accounted for 60-70% of global trade. What is the USA's share of global trade today? It's no longer at the level it was. But yet the dollar accounts for over 50% of global trade transactions today. And given what happened to Iran and now what happened to Russia in terms of unilateral sanctions, including financial sanctions and freezing of assets, we felt that it was important for us to look at, first of all, enhancing trade between ourselves. And this is a common agenda of BRICS. As we increase trade between ourselves, we asked ourselves, why can't we trade in our own currencies? And this is why this was put on the agenda. And this will continue. It's now far wider than BRICS. You have seen India has signed agreements, I think, with 20 plus countries to trade in the rupee. And so has Russia and so has China. And within Africa, part of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it stipulates in that agreement that we must look at trading in our own currencies. That's why we created the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System under the architecture of the AU. And some 20 African central banks have subscribed to this. And it's estimated that trading in local currencies as part of the AFCTA will save Africa annually $5 billion US. That's substantial. That's substantial. So we are saying that we must be given greater choices in terms of determining the currency we use for trade with our foreign partners, as well as the payment system. Why should we just be using the SWIFT system? Why can't we create our own platforms like you are doing, like other countries are doing? So this is actually misinformation about a BRICS currency. Indian immigration to Africa, well, I've spoken of the South African experience, and of course you had Indian laborers going to other parts of Africa as well. The Indian diaspora in Africa today, I think, is about 3.5 million. It's quite a strong diaspora, quite spread out. I think Zimbabwe, you have quite a sizable Indian origin community as well. It's spread out throughout the African continent, and they have been generally a positive contributor to the African economy. They are not seen as Indians, they are Africans, as I've said. They have assimilated totally in those countries. They're second, third, fourth, fifth generation Indo-Africans, if I can use that term. So it's been a positive force. They have contributed positively. They have not been a divisive force on the African continent, like you see with some other entities that there are tensions incoming and especially in the economic space. We haven't had that. From time to time, it's exploited for political, let me be frank with you. It's exploited by certain political entities, but this is a minute part of the totality. Generally, there is a positive dimension to it, and I think South Africa's example is a good example that you have in many other countries as well. I think the question you asked is a very important question, and I hope that at the level of India-Africa, we can strengthen collaboration. Yesterday, someone from an organization called the International Research and Development Center, you're probably aware, this organization has offices. It's a Canada-based research entity that supports research globally, including in Africa. They have an office for Africa in Nairobi, and they also have an office in South Africa. And I was looking at the collaboration and where they are funding. And one of the questions I asked is, it's a very small number of institutions and universities. How do we expand this between ourselves and across the African continent? Because I think it's important that we have greater collaboration between our students, between our academics, between our institutions, and between our think tanks, because there's so much. I keep making the point that India is so involved in the African continent at every level, be it the economic level, be it government to government level, be it between people to people level, and in various sectors. But we are not capitalizing on this. And I think the absence of not having a summit for almost 10 years has actually created a vacuum. And I hope that we can create linkages between our institutions and do it systematically. And the starting point should be through MEA. And I think we should create a directory. In South Africa, you have a number of think tanks that are active in collaboration with India. One of the projects we identified, and I just spoke to one of my colleagues at a university in South Africa, in speaking with because they have given $600,000 to one of our think tanks, which is overseeing the T20. And we said we should do a research program focusing on the 4 presidencies of the Global South: Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. It's a unique period in the history of the G20. But what contribution have we made in holding the successive G20 presidencies of the Global South? We have strengthened the G20. And I said, as South Africa has part of its focus, a review, a reflection of the past 20 years and the way forward, which we are calling G20 at 20. That exercise is being undertaken in the Sherpa track. But I said that we, as the 4 countries, identify 4 institutions, South Africa, India, Brazil, and Indonesia, and do a joint study that can feed into this study. Because I think we are making a unique contribution, and this has to be captured somewhere. So the room for collaboration is vast. We have many programs in South Africa. We even have a program at the university that both of us taught at, and to fund PhD students fully. So you can go and do your PhD there and it will be paid for. And not much of this is known. And you have various such structures here in India, in South Africa, and other parts of Africa. But I think it's very weak, the current architecture. And yet there's such vast room for collaboration, joint research, and exchanges. So I hope this is something that we can feed into the agenda for when the India-Africa Summit takes place.
Thank you so much. This was a delightful conversation, and we have taken much more time than you initially gave us. So thank you for your patience. I know there were many other questions, and many of you wanted to intervene. But thank you for your patience as well, and I hope you can have that communication with a very accessible High Commissioner later on. But thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us. All that's left for me is to give him a big round of applause. Join me.